I have worked in Jerusalem and the West Bank, as the blurb on me said, for about 27 years now. And one of the issues that's continuously concerned me is questions about intercommunalism. How is it, for instance, that in the Bethlehem region and in Jerusalem, Muslims and Jews are able, Muslims and Christians are in certain situations able to share places, to share professions, to share terrains, to live together, but at other times break into fairly antagonistic groupings. I think actually under the impetus of a leadership that talks them into doing that. But this got me very interested in a whole series of questions around where Judaism fits in with this. And I did some work several years ago, and Carl and I met at this point at a Birzeit conference on diasporic identity politics. And I'll very briefly point out two moments because I think it answers to some of your questions about talking about Jewish history. One of the things I wanted to look at was really the creation of Judaism out of the Babylonian exile. And what you had in the 7th century before the Christian era was a fairly syncretic mixing of peoples in the area that we call Palestine, where there were we call henotheism, a multitude of different gods, some of them higher than other gods, but basically various Baals who were local gods and a multitude of various divinities that one approached at certain kinds of times. Within that context, and I won't go into the detail of it, within that context, the Yahwist group became a significant group. Yahweh was a war god and a storm god, which a certain group of dissidents began to follow within that community. When the Babylonians first conquered the area, they got rid of one population of elite, and they left behind the Yahwists. The second Babylonian conquering of the area, and what the Babylonians would do when they conquered an area, was take out the elites, the empowered people, which very often were precisely those who were tied not only with religious power but also political power, and take them into exile. And they took the Yahwists out as a group and put them in Babylon. And this is where Judaism is born, because one of the small groups of Yahwists, most of them were integrated into the larger society around them and disappeared into Babylonian society. One small group maintained an identity, and they maintained an identity by setting up a different calendar, by setting up different food rituals, by setting up a whole series of things that made it very difficult for them to integrate with the surrounding population. And their whole identity was precisely structured around the enclaving of this identity against this encompassing Babylonian multitude of peoples around them. 60 years after the exile, they returned to Palestine, or they returned to Judea. And when they returned to Judea, what they discover in Judea is the same population that they had been pulled out of 60, 70 years earlier. But that population still is henotheistic, still is fairly syncretistic, is not Yahwist because the Yahwist leadership had been pulled out, and they begin to set themselves off against these people. And if you read, as probably nobody does, Ezra and Nehemiah, it's quite clear from those two books that over the course of the next 100 years, a radical racial political difference is set up between those who stayed behind and those who've come back from the exile. And that has to do with the fact that these people who stayed behind are allegedly foreigners who were brought in by the Babylonians while the Yahwists were outside. They can't marry into these groups. If people have married into them, they need to divorce their wives. They need to get rid of, take property back from them. In other words, what one suddenly sees is the Judean population split into two racially distinct populations out of a single population. And this is precisely this matter of enclaving. Let me jump now, obscenely as it may be, about another 2,500 years, to another central moment of Jewish enclaving. And that is Herzl's own program of beginning to set up an idea of how Judaism fits into the cosmopolitanism of 19th century Europe. What you see in the 19th century, particularly in Central Europe, is a Judaism which has really become fairly archaic, fairly abandoned by people, and many people who are still Jewish by family and by name are trying, as Herzl was very hard, to integrate themselves into the larger cosmopolitan society around them. And Herzl was particularly a leader in getting rid of this idea of being separate from Western society, Western Christian society. And he came up with several solutions, the first of which was a mass conversion of all of the Jews of Vienna into Christianity. In other words, okay, we will simply give up this kind of identity. Other ones were about various kinds of joining into various kinds of sword fighting clubs there were a number of policies that were being set out as ways of integrating into into the surrounding society. What began to happen, though, partially because of political changes at the time, the coming into power of the so-called Christian Democrats, who were actually an anti-Semitic group, and partially because of happenings in France with the I'm going to lose my names. What's the
Great.
yeah. Herzl begins to realize that this isn't possible. What's going on at this moment, though, is Herzl's assumption about why this isn't possible is because, why Herzl is trying to abandon Judaism in the first place is because he feels that the cosmopolitan Christian society surrounding him are labeling Jews as somehow distinct from them. Why are they labeling them as distinct from them? Because of what he called the Eastern Jews, or the Mauschel. Mauschel basically, I'm afraid, translates as Yid, and that is effectively the way that he talked about it. Those Jews from Eastern Europe who live in ghettos, who separate themselves off from others, who follow their religious thing, who dress differently, who eat differently, they poison, or actually contaminate, as people use downstairs about your work. They contaminate the cosmopolitan Jews with the idea of an essential Jewishness that is dirty, is low, is something they want to abandon. Herzl wants to leave that behind. He feels that those people are dragging him down. He wants to turn the Jews into something that abandons that. He discovers, because of these various events in the late 19th century, it's not possible, and comes up with a policy instead that if we cannot be Europeans in Europe, we will be Europeans elsewhere. And out of this comes the eventual elaboration of the whole policy of going first of all to Rhodesia or South Africa, finally settling in Palestine itself, and setting up in Palestine a society in which Jews could become fully human Europeans. However, various kinds of things come into play there, various kinds of really in some ways quite antagonistic kind of activities towards others come in. And in some ways, one of the things that I write about is the problem that Herzl ends up defining the Sephardic Jews and the Jews from the Arab world as precisely the kind of same Yids that he was trying to protect himself from in Europe itself. But effectively what happens is you get an identity that is constructed against an outside, which ironically in both cases is an inside. And I think that to some degree comes back to very much to Gilad's point. There is a part of self that one is attempting to drive away, to expunge from oneself. But in doing that, one ends up isolating oneself in a selfhood or in an identity that is enclaved, set off against the rest of the world around it. I think what we see in the whole syndrome that Gilad is examining in the book, and I love his term, pre-traumatic stress syndrome, is this idea of the necessity of a wall that surrounds, the necessity of a wall that protects an identity inside. And I think this comes back to your question about whether identity is fundamentally based on an act of fear, an act of othering, an act of setting oneself off from an outside around it. I find Gilad's work very exciting because I find it profoundly what I would call anti-identitarian. I think one of the really significant problems that has come up, particularly, really probably starting with the end of the First World War and certain kinds of ideas about nationality then, but what we're beginning to do is more and more move into identity politics. And each group of us is supposed to have some sort of essential core identity that sets us off from other groups. That means we have a set of particular cultural traits, dietary traits, calendrical traits, whatever. That means that we can't really work with others, be like others. And I think that separation, that enclaving, I think, is a fundamental aspect of the modern world, and it's quite possible that what makes Israel so attractive to America and the various states that support it is it's precisely the deification of that kind of politics, of essentialist identity. I don't even need 2 minutes. I would simply say that I think Gilad's book is a very brave attack against this. I think it's philosophically quite profound at several points, and I think Gilad's point about why people are so, particularly people who feel themselves to be ideological Jews are so threatened by it is precisely because it goes at the crux of a whole series of issues of who they are and how they feel themselves to be separate from the others. And my hope would simply be that this book actually sets up the possibility that we do simply have really multiple identities, situational identities that shift all the time and allow us to work in political groupings, in various kinds of situations with other people in intercommunalism. Thank you.
So not long to wait, chaps.